creepy crawlies underneath my skin until I wake up to the sounds of spiders in my dreams. Hi-ho, everybody. Dippy, not the Anthony Fantano DM here, and it's time for a review of this 2024 Osgood Perkins project, Longlegs. Longlegs is a psych, horror, thriller, written and directed by Osgood Perkins, with cinematography by Andres Arochi and produced in large part by Nicolas Cage, who not only had a large role in getting the movie made, but also promoting it via all of the marketing material that came out in the early summer and late spring of 2024, leading up to its July 12th release. Neon Entertainment emphasized the fact that Longlegs was going to be one of the scariest characters ever shown on the screen, that it was going to be one of the most horrifying experiences simply because of the presence that Nicolas Cage brings to the titular character, Longlegs. But as we come to find out, it seems that all of the horror stems from tropes that we have seen in movies that have long passed the scare factor for younger audiences to understand, or have been done before for all of its older audience. Now, as with any review like this, there are spoilers abound after my preliminary explanation, so I recommend you go watch this movie and formulate your own opinions, and not just listen to mine on the subject, but you already knew that. One of the promotional materials for Longlegs itself uses the main character of Lee Harker, played by Micah Monroe, stepping into the interrogation room with Longlegs, played by Nicolas Cage, for the first time. And they have hooked up a pulse meter to her. Whether or not that's true is up to question. But the pulse meter showcases her main character being completely paralyzed in fear, with a monstrous heart rate that you can hear just completely going at a motorcycle's pace when she sees the character for the first time. And the reason that I don't really believe it is because the only truly creepy factor of Longlegs himself is his outward appearance. He is a very obviously morbidly grotesque being designed to shock anyone into thinking how a person like this could actually look like that when they haven't taken one step inside of any of the states in the American South. But if you dig a little deeper than the crusty pores on Longlegs' face, you find that we've seen this villain before in pictures like the Amityville Horror, who are nothing more than Satan worshippers given a platform in a small town that allows them to run rampant. It's a plot that has been done over and over again, especially in the modern horror landscape. We were escaping this cookie-cutter era of having a horror story that is almost exactly the same as every other one, except it's set in fucking Pangea somewhere. So how does Longlegs stand out? How does it make itself different in any regard? Well, it sets itself apart by being one of the most beautiful movies I've seen this year. The aesthetic of 1990s Oregon is very specific, and it feels like that this movie could have been made during the time and saved in a vault until it appeared again all these years later. At the same time, there are effects that are brought into place to make the jumping of time more obvious to the viewer and more stylistically pleasurable for the viewer. Aesthetically, you do jump back and forth between a couple of different points in time, from the mid to late 1990s to the late 1970s, as we swap back and forth between viewpoints, discovering the origins of the Harker family, Lee and her mother experiencing the horrors of the original killing spree of the titular Longlegs. This Longlegs killer who has been doing this streak since at least the late 1960s. The opening scene of the movie acts as foreshadowing only in that you get a sneak peek of Longlegs very early on, and the young version of Lee Harker is not clarified as such until the movie is practically 2/3 of the way finished. You're supposed to see this from Harker's perspective as she hides information from her chief of police, played by Blair Underwood. And by the end of the movie, she learns that not only is her mother an accomplice, but is also the primary driving force behind all of the killings that have taken place in this strange pattern that has been arranged by Longlegs and herself. The pattern being Satan worship. We have seen these tropes implemented that if you can't write a good, unique serial killer, just make them worship the devil. And unfortunately, this is the stumbling block that has caught Osgood Perkins red-handed. Leading into the moment that I sat in the theater, I thought that Longlegs, being this creepy envisionment of a character, would have been more cunning, would have been more clever, would have had a grander design in mind than just the cryptic notes and clues that are portrayed throughout the course of the movie itself. The number 14 is brought up a lot, and it's not really made entirely clear why the number 14 is such an important point, other than it sits like right in the middle of the year, and it can very easily be 6 digits ahead of or 6 digits behind 14 in order to craft this satanic triangle that is found in a logbook halfway through and somehow not really coupled into the actual murder-suicides themselves until sitting in an interrogation room with the killer and him very cryptically explaining until he just reveals in an obvious statement that the man downstairs has a present for every child and that those who are brought into him will give his power greatness. It's a movie that relies overtly on its premise being something that you're familiar with, falls apart when it becomes too familiar. Earlier on, I mentioned that it sets itself apart by being one of the most beautiful examples of a story so overdone, and that stands true. Andres Arochi displays a very pure cinematic eye through his lens, and it leads to some incredible-looking shots of the various vistas of the Pacific Northwest in the 90s, but also these very cramped, dark shots inside of barns and abandoned houses as they're being investigated, with naturally hazed flashlights acting as the only light source in a very moody setting. It looks brilliant. The sound design is something to be applauded too. There are moments in this movie that I was literally sitting on the edge of my seat trying to listen for the little rustles and whispers that were being played in the background for Harker to pick up on and investigate. It really drew me in the sense that there are these alien sounds playing that kind of resonate not just like in the mix directly in front of you, but also behind you and to the right and somewhere off to your left-hand side. And it makes you look over to where, making you follow the action of the character in the movie, but also in your own environment. It didn't rely too heavily on jump scares as many others in this genre do to get their visceral reactions, but there are a couple non-music sting related jump scares that did genuinely get me. Aside from both of those, the score is very minimal, but it's inclusive of the experience. The ending leaves a lot to be desired because at this point in the movie, we know how the killings were done, we know who was involved in the killings, and we know how that Lee can stop the killings herself. But she doesn't have the heart to do it because it's her own mother who is involved directly in the killings. And it's not until the head investigator that has been with Lee basically this whole time has already killed his wife that Lee does something about it. She initially wants him to listen to reason, but the demon core in the head of the doll that was made for his daughter has already influenced his mind and has already turned him to the crazies and the stabbies. There's also a weird moment where one of the, medical practitioners that is helping out the investigators is being really weirdly compassionate and acts a little creepy in his own right towards the structure of the doll that is found at the climactic turning point where Harker and the head investigator find this piece of grand evidence to be examined. They don't initially get anything from it, but the actual scene itself was almost creepier than half of Longlegs' interactions throughout, simply because he takes a little bit too keen of an interest in the construction of the doll itself. It could have maybe been toned down to make the distinction between protagonist and antagonist a little more clear and distinct than what is initially given forth to the viewing audience. Every mechanical aspect of this movie is brilliant, but the plot being so derivative and so overused leads to a lot of major markdowns from this being an excellent movie to actually go and watch in the theater. You would honestly have a better experience sitting at home in the dark than you would in a theater. I was lucky enough that I had basically a private screening because it was apparent to me afterwards why so few people were actually going and watching Longlegs for themselves, because it's honestly subpar as a horror experience in the theater. Just as a nitpick, I thought that Longlegs would have a deeper implication on the methods of the killings themselves, being something akin to spiders or paranormal or, a web of lies. But Osgood Perkins came out in an interview and said that he only picked the name Longlegs because it sounded creepy for the time. Which it does, but that shouldn't be the primary factor behind the name of a serial killer. Well, then again, I guess there really isn't ever a primary factor, is there? But with all of the mechanical aspects being woven together into a web of a beautiful viewing experience, which is 90% of the job, I'll go ahead and give Longlegs the credit where it's due and score it an 89 out of 100. And that's the end of this video about video. If you've seen Longlegs, write a comment below and tell me what you think. If you liked, hit the like. If you didn't, then don't. Hit the subscribe if you don't mind, and ring the lunch bell so you get all the notifications about my content when it's posted. Thank you so much for watching, and until next time, that's a wrap.